Hi, my name is Eda320, and I really like tanks. So much so, in fact, that I've decided to embark on a journey across the internet and gaming world alike to find some of the wackiest, coolest, and best made tanks in video games. I'll be looking at everything from the plausibly realistic to the downright insane. I am utterly baffled as to why they chose the Stug 4 for this game, and I am incredibly appalled that they represented it so badly. So if this sounds like something you're interested in, stick around and listen up, because this is a Tank Enthusiast Reacts to tanks in video games. No, we're not doing any of that. Nope, Halloween is over. We did the pumpkin carving stream. No more Halloween. We're done with that, okay? It's Thanksgiving time now, everybody. Welcome back to Ed320 Thanksgiving edition. Today, we are going to be, hold on a second. Hello? Thanksgiving is over? It's December? What are you talking about? The Canada vlog? Yeah, no, I'm working on that still. It's fine. Look, if we're lucky, it'll get done before 2023. I know. I love you too. Okay. Alright, well, I'm filming a video right now, so... Okay, bye-bye. There was no one on the other end of that phone. Welcome back, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, to... I forgot the name of the show. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, of the World Wide Web to Tank Enthusiast Reacts. Today, as I'm sure you can tell by the title of the video if you're watching this, today we are reacting to Battlefield 5. I'm particularly excited about this one because it means that we actually get to look at real historical tanks. Now, full disclosure, before this video, I actually had a pretty negative opinion of Battlefield 5. Played Battlefield 5 for a little bit and didn't really like it, so I dropped it and just thought, yeah, the game's crap. EA messed up. Don't touch it ever again. But of course, to make this video, I had to go back in and record a bunch more footage and actually, try to play the game properly and actually learn all of the new mechanics. And in doing so, I've kind of fallen in love with Battlefield 5, I'm not gonna lie to you. I've honestly been playing Battlefield 5 non-stop for the last, 3 weeks. Honestly, that's probably the reason why I haven't uploaded in so long, is because I've just been so busy grinding Battlefield 5. In fact, it's so bad that in the beginning of my recording for this video, I had nothing unlocked. And I was just like, yeah, I'll just cycle through it and, I'll show you guys what the unlock options are for each tank, and we'll just get the visual and then we'll hop out. I'm not gonna go through the effort to grind the game just to get all the unlocks for every tank in the game just so I can present them for the video. I kind of ended up doing that anyways. Battlefield 5 is structured into 4 basic factions. Basic factions are the only factions in the game. The UK, Germany, America, and Japan. Rest in peace, Soviet Union. I guess the Eastern Front just didn't happen in this universe. Whatever, fair enough. Actually not fair, I'm actually quite angry about that. We're gonna go faction by faction, and yes, I am crazy enough that I'm going to attempt to review every tank in the game, condense it into a video. I don't know how I'm gonna do it, but we're gonna try. But without wasting any more time, let's take a look at the tanks of Battlefield 5.
It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye to Piccadilly,
So to kick things off, we're going to talk about the United Kingdom, and this tank appears to be a Valentine. Pretty cool pick, actually. Looks like the Mark 5, 6, 7, 8. I can't count. Valentine was a very popular British infantry tank during World War II. Very early war tank, developed in 1939, approved for production, was really hiked up in the queue, so to speak, say we need to get these things out there now and fast. And so by the time Dunkirk happened, this thing was fast-tracked into production. Interestingly, this seems to be hailed as a Mark 8, but we don't have the 6-pounder, which is a bit odd. Thankfully, though, we do have the 6-pounder as a researchable upgrade I'm seeing right here. So by its default configuration, it is quite literally not a Valentine Mark 8 until you put that 6-pounder on it. Everything else seems nice. We also seem to have the researchable APCR upgrade. Britain was very much interested in armor piercing with all of their guns. British tanks did not carry high explosive ammunition, or at the very least, it's not very popular. The Valentine in of itself is a pretty fun tank to include actually in this game because it's kind of an underrated tank. The Valentine doesn't get a lot of spotlight, which is quite sad, especially amongst British tanks. But the Valentine was very well used, I guess would be my term. It was everywhere, and especially in Lend-Lease. A lot of people give the Americans the most credit for Lend-Lease, which is very much true. The Americans donated a shit ton of equipment to pretty much everybody, but the British in particular also donated a lot of equipment to in particular Russia. Although they would never admit it, you can go back and you can find these documents that detail that the Russians, they grew a very real fondness for the tank. So much so that actually towards the end of the war, they only kept making Valentines specifically to give to Russia. And we also have a Churchill, of course we do. You cannot do the British faction in World War II tanks without a Churchill. It looks fantastic. Churchill looks like they went with the Mark 7, which, you know, all's fair in love and war. It's a great mark of the Churchill. Looks really, really good. The model is awesome. Churchill is much more of an infantry tank as opposed to the Valentine, which seems to be this weird gray area. The Churchill is a tried and true infantry tank. So what do I mean when I say infantry tank? Well, Britain actually had a very interesting way of categorizing their tanks. They didn't do it the way everyone else did with, say, you know, you'd have light tanks, medium tanks, heavy tanks. They really only had two main classes of tanks, what they called infantry tanks and cruiser tanks. It's actually kind of sad that they actually don't seem to have any cruiser tanks in the British lineup here. The other three tanks we have are basically just variants of the Churchill and the Valentine. The Archer as well, a tank destroyer built on the Valentine chassis. Pretty awesome again to see in the game. Fun fact about the Archer is that the front of the tank, the front of the Archer, looks suspiciously like the back of the Valentine, because it is. The Archer was quite literally a backwards tank. The gun had to face over the back of the engine deck. So yes, that did mean that in order to operate it, you had to reverse. The tank still drove forward, was still forward, and backwards was still backwards. So to fire the cannon on the Archer, you actually had to put it in reverse and swing the gun around. Now this is a really interesting tank to see. This is, as it says, the Churchill gun carrier, 3-inch gun carrier. It was quite literally just an excuse to stuff a bigger cannon onto the Churchill. The British were always pretty dissatisfied with their cannons. The 2-pounder was very well known to be pretty antiquated for the times that it was being put into service. The 6-pounder starts coming into play in very slow and limited numbers. They like that. It's a bit better. It becomes apparent to Britain that they need to get something with 75, 76 millimeters out there, and the 3-inch stuffed onto a Churchill worked. Although there were not very many of them built at all, less than 100, I think it was like 50 or 60 if my mind serves me correct. And interestingly, within the upgrades that you can make for this tank, they've included the snake launchers. Yes, this is also a real thing, and yes, it also did look like that. Yeah. Ah, the good old Panzer IV, am I right? Panzer in German is just the word for tank. So to call something a Panzer IV is to call it a Tank IV. And so in English, the British in particular usually just translated it to Mark IV. If you've ever heard the Panzer IV referred to as a Mark IV, that's why. It looks awesome. It seems like it starts out with the short 75, which is true. The Panzer IV was developed in 1936, 1937, before the war started. One of the only tanks that was produced throughout the entire war. It started production before the war began, and it was produced all the way up till the very end. So with the short 75, that makes this a AUS F. Basically just short 75 with the full front flat plate, pretty much the developed hull of the Panzer IV, right before they go to the F2 and first put on the long 75, which then leads them directly into the G. From there, the Panzer IV continues to have that longer tank destroyer gun in it. And within the Panzer IV's upgrade options, we do kind of get to go through the different variants that existed. If you slap additional Schutzen armor, that turret, extra armor on the turret, extra armor on the sides, that was real, particularly in the Panzer IV AUS H. is then when we're starting to get into side armor, and then here we can put the Pak 40 on there, and now it's an OSF-G. I actually really like the upgrade system for this game. I am personally a huge fan of a system like that, and in fact, I am of the probably extremely minority opinion that I think War Thunder should do it this way. I think World of Tanks Blitz does something somewhat like that, but I don't know if you can go through like entire variants of a tank that way. I think you can just do sort of the minor upgrades. And we're not going to talk about Warpath. Nobody bring up Warpath in the comments. We are not talking about Warpath. And all the stowage options that you can do, all of the sort of cosmetic stowages you can add to it are really, really fun, actually. The sandbag one, this is very much something that was done. Additional armor was used a lot during World War II, particularly within the American Army. Post-war, and even during the war they knew this, but post-war they really did the testing and found that it's not really that effective. Sandbags against a tank shell. I mean, you think about a wall of sandbags and then firing an armor-piercing shell through a wall of sandbags. It's gonna go right through. So why does taking that sandbag wall and then suddenly strapping it to the side of your tank, that shell's still gonna go straight through it as if it's nothing, and all you've really done is added a shit ton of weight to your tank. In the German army and the American armies, it was very much frowned upon. And of course we have the Tiger, Tiger 1 as it is accurately called. This is very much an early war variant. You can tell because of the cupola, the pistol ports in it, but it also has the rear loading hatch, so it's not like the earliest Tiger that it could be. The original paint scheme that this tank seems to have, it's very odd. It's not quite the right shade of tan that I would have expected for a desert tan. But when I think of the Tiger and I'm thinking of that desert tan Tiger, it's something much deeper, something much more saturated. This color is very weird, a very, very, very strange color for a Tiger. And as for upgrades, it doesn't actually seem like we can do anything really that fun with the Tiger. Seems like you can put some Zimrit on there, which is great. Zimrit was basically this anti-magnetic sort of paste that was applied to the outside of many German tanks during the war. Eventually ended up abandoning it because it turned out that nobody actually used anti-magnetic mines except the Germans, so they had this measure to defend against a technology that only they were using, so it was just thrown away because it was unnecessary. But Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, Tiger 2s I think definitely are very famous for having Zimrit. It kind of looks, it's kind of weird seeing a Tiger 2 or a Panther without Zimrit. It just doesn't quite look right. Whoa. Hold on, pause that. Huh. So we have a Sturmgeschütz, a Stug, if you would prefer. Sturmgeschütz, German translation is assault gun. If you're going to put a Sturmgeschütz in the game, I would have expected them to put in a Sturmgeschütz 3. The Stug 3 was actually the most mass-produced tank of the German army in World War II. They made a little over 10,000 of them. This, however, is a Sturmgeschütz 4. What the fuck is the difference, I'm sure you're asking? Well, I actually have an entire tank documentary video dissecting the entirety of the Stug 3, why it came to be, production history, how many of them were made, all the different variants, and how to identify all the different variants just using your visuals alone. But this isn't a Stug 3, this is a Stug 4, which was basically just the same idea, but you do it to a Panzer IV. Factories producing the Stug 3 were bombed very heavily in 1943, and so around the turn of the middle of the war, Germany started having to get creative in replacing the Stug 3. Also, fun fact, the bombing of Stug 3 factories and Germany trying to find a replacement for the Stug also led to the creation of the Hetzer, which was the exact same thing, but that was done to the Panzer 38T. The Sturmgeschütz 4 was brought into production in 1943, well after the longer 75 had been put onto the Stug 3, and the Stug 3 was basically no longer a infantry support vehicle, it became a tank destroyer, even though the Germans would never change the name, and they would never acknowledge it as a tank destroyer for some reason. It was a tank destroyer, and it was being used as a tank destroyer. By 1943, the idea of the Stug having a short 75 and being used for infantry support in some sort of assault gun role is gone. So why this game portrays the Sturmgeschütz 4 as having a tiny short 75 assault gun, I have no clue. The Sturmgeschütz 4 from day one would have been made as a tank destroyer, but for some reason this that mantlet is so bad. The mantlet is they just yoinked that model straight off the Panzer IV and just slapped it straight on the front of this. So we can put the long 75 on here, and it does have the pig nose mantlet, thank God. We can also put Schützen on the sides, thank God, and we can put Zimrit on it, thank God. So In its default vanilla no upgrade state, this characterization of the Sturmgeschütz 4 is incredibly wrong. It seems like they wanted to just put the Stoke 3 in the game. There would be no issues here if they had just used the Stoke 3. And then you could put the long 75 on it afterwards, you could put shirts in, you could put smoke launchers, all of those were added. Go watch my video, you can see the evolution of the Stoke 3, and you can see all the different beautiful upgrade options that they could have given you. What boggles me is that to even know that the Stoke 4 exists, this was a deliberate decision. Somebody did the research, and they knew a Stoke 3 from a Stoke 4, and they had to have known that the Stoke 3 had over 10,000 units produced, and the Stoke 4 had just over 1,000 units produced. One of them, the most produced German tank of the entire war, and the other one, a cursed last-ditch effort modification. I am utterly baffled as to why they chose the Stoke 4 for this game, and I am incredibly appalled that they represented it so badly. Ah, Sherman. Oh, Sherman, my beloved. To continue shouting my own channel out, I have also made a slightly confusing guide to the Sherman, explaining every single variant of the Sherman that existed, how many were produced, why they were built, and what the changes are, and helping you identify all the different variants of the Sherman just by looks alone. So the Sherman tank they've modeled here, a Sherman M4A3 75W VVSS. Let's go through that. Well, M4A3 is the designation of what model it is, and we know it's an M4A3 because of the engine deck. What's special about the M4A3 is that it used the Ford GAA V8 gasoline engine. 75 denotes the gun. W indicates wet ammunition stowage. The reason we know this has wet ammunition stowage is because it doesn't have any of that extra applique armor panels on the sides of the tank, which were there to protect the ammunition racks, the dry ammunition racks that were in older models of Sherman. When they moved over to wet ammunition stowage, they moved the ammunition from the sponsons on the side of the tank. They moved it to armored bins underneath the turret. And VVSS is to denote the suspension system. And we talked about VVSS suspension already on the Tank Enthusiast Reacts to the Scorpion video. Interesting thing about this Sherman is that it is actually a pretty rare variant of the Sherman. In fact, so rare that we can pinpoint down that this model of Sherman would have almost certainly been manufactured by Fisher Body. There were a lot of different manufacturers of Shermans, but Fisher Body was the sole manufacturer of M4A3 75W VVSS Sherman tanks. And then even more specifically, this tank has large hatches and direct vision ports, which is also quite weird because Shermans with direct vision ports were never manufactured by Fisher Body. This model of Sherman is very much an intermediate model. It has a lot of early features, such as the direct vision ports, such as VVSS, such as the earlier model turret with the split open commander's hatches rather than a all vision block cupola. But it also has wet ammunition stowage and is a large hatch variant of the M4A3, which are indicative of sort of a mid to late war model. This tank was almost certainly manufactured by Fisher Body between 1943 and 1944. Completely ignoring the fact that Fisher Body never made large hatch Shermans that had direct vision ports. These direct vision ports are completely anachronistic. I don't know why they're there. They shouldn't be there. So you might be thinking, why the heck did they choose such a specific model of Sherman? And again, this is such a specific model that I'm literally able to tell you what fucking factory manufactured it. I think the reason is that they wanted something generic, and the most, generic Sherman I can possibly think of is an M4A3 with VVSS, a short 75, and large hatches. When you think of Sherman tank, this is the one that comes to your head. And I call it a rare variant of the Sherman, but Fisher Body did end up manufacturing just over 3,000 of these. It's rare in terms of Shermans, as far as the 50,000 plus Shermans that were built. And on the continuing excruciating detailed examination of this tank, also seems to have a Chrysler model sprocket on the tank. Chrysler, one of the other many manufacturers of the Sherman, had a very specific design for their sprockets of Chrysler produced Shermans. You can always tell a Sherman was produced by Chrysler if it has this very special sprocket that this tank has in the game. However, considering we know for a fact that this tank has to have been built by Fisher Body, not sure where that came from, because Chrysler definitely did not manufacture these tanks. Chrysler manufactured mostly the M4A4. Chrysler manufactured the M4A6, and they manufactured the composite Shermans, which are all, go do your research, or go watch my video because I mentioned literally all of them. Also, check out the Sherman Minutia homepage. That website is fantastic. If you want a completely unfathomably detailed knowledge level of the Sherman, just browse the Sherman Minutia homepage. Just go in there and just spend like 2 days straight on it, and you will become a Sherman god. So point being, this is a model of Sherman that existed. It's not historically accurate, it should not have direct vision ports, and it should not have a Chrysler style sprockets. For all intents and purposes, probably the most generic Sherman tank you could have possibly picked, except maybe an M4A1 or just a standard box M4. And of course, it's no surprise that the Sherman has probably one of the most extensive upgrade trees of all the other tanks. We can upgrade the engine. I'm not sure how that works because this is an M43, meaning it only ever has one engine. If you change out the engine, it now becomes a new model of Sherman. That's the only thing that changes between any model of Sherman. A1, A2, A3, A4, or just standard box M4. Actually, well, no, the M4 and the M4A1 had the same engine, but that's besides the point. Go watch my video on the Sherman. And of course, we can do the 76. We can upgrade the entire turret of the tank and put in the 76mm gun. This was, by far the biggest upgrade that was done to the Sherman, the most notable, the most famous. There was attempts to put the 76mm cannon into a Sherman as early as 1942, but it wouldn't work out, and it wasn't until 1944 that they finally designed a new turret that was big enough to house that 76mm cannon. We can put a coaxial flamethrower and turn this into Sherman Crocodile. Flamethrowers are a thing that have existed on tanks for pretty much as long as tanks have existed. Countries like Britain and Russia actually are the two most notable I can think of that really loved putting flamethrowers in their tanks. If you go all the way back to initial design specifications for the T-34, in the very first set of requirements for what would end up becoming the T-34, they specified that they wanted space to put a flamethrower on it. British, very famously with the Churchill Crocodile, experimented with flamethrower tanks. The Germans with the Flammpanzer III, which was basically a Panzer III, but you take out the gun and you put a giant tube for a big-ass flamethrower. I have seen many different photos of sort of a Sherman configured the exact same way that the Churchill Crocodile was, which was they replaced the coaxial machine gun down in the hull. They replaced that with a flamethrower, and there was piping that led all the way to the back and a trailer that was hauled behind the tank to store the fuel for said flamethrower. But the way this game does it, and the way that a lot of video games portray it, was that instead you're replacing the coaxial machine gun with a flamethrower, or at least you have a flamethrower in the coaxial spot. The Sherman with like a second barrel is a very iconic image, and so a lot of video games, when they portray the flamethrower Sherman, that's the one that they portray. But we also have the other mainstay upgrades of the Sherman here. We've got the 105mm howitzer. However, the way that it is portrayed here is dead wrong, in that we very simply just swap out the barrel. It wasn't just as simple as just taking the barrel of the 75 out and throwing in the 105. That entire mantlet housing had to be taken out and put in. Thankfully, the Sherman was designed to be very modular. You could just unbolt the entire mantlet, take it out, and then slot in a new one. Also, fun fact, 105mm howitzer Shermans were all manufactured by Chrysler, which is potentially how they got the sprockets mixed up. Maybe they were also doing research on what a 105mm howitzer Sherman looks like, and they found the Chrysler sprocket on those tanks and decided for some reason that they should put it on this one. Very weird. If you put the 105 on this tank, you now have a Fisher body A3 wet ammo storage with VVSS, direct vision ports, and a Chrysler sprocket, and an incorrect mantlet with your 105mm gun. That's quite something, actually, I'm gonna say right now. That is quite something. I like how earlier I was praising this system and saying like, oh, this is the great way to do upgrading your tanks and really good way to do progression, and like, oh, this is awesome. I think all tank games should do it this way. Little do I remember the consequences of giving players that much freedom. It's like being able to use the gunsmith in Call of Duty Vanguard. Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Well. If it isn't the consequences of my action.
And finally, we have Japan. I'm gonna try my hardest here, but Japanese naming schemes for all of their tanks are very confusing. Type 97, also known as the Chi-Ha. Japan and tanks have actually been more closely related than you might think. Tanks have always sort of been in the Japanese culture. Japan actually had some really, really good tanks in the 1930s. In the interwar period, tanks like the Chiha. You know, actually, if you really think about it, you know, you're seeing like tanks like the Vickers coming out of the UK. You're seeing tanks like the 7TP and the T-26, which are built off the Vickers. You're seeing tanks like the BT. You're seeing tanks like the Panzer I and Panzer II. You know, all of these very, very lighter tanks and very small tanks coming out of countries in the interwar period. And then you have Japan coming out here with tanks like the Chiha, very ahead of the time actually for tank technology in the 1930s. Well-designed tanks. The problem is Japan had a lot of beef between the Army and the Air Force and the Navy. All of their branches really competed for money, for development time, for research time. Although tanks were doing them really good in the 20s and 30s, by the time World War II breaks out and Japan decides to go to war with America and blitz the Philippines, they put more priority into their Navy, and as such, tanks are sort of left behind. And so what happens is you have Japan coming into World War II with designs from 1934, 1935, with practically zero updates. And so, sadly and naturally, they just kind of get fucking obliterated. So very interesting here, looking at the upgrades that we can do for the Chiha. We have, as a part of all the different options of a gun that you can put on this tank, the 75 Type 3 here, it almost looks like this changes the entire tank. Just adding this gun, it's not like the Sherman where we're changing the turret. Literally, like, the entire tank changes. Towards the end of the war, Japan is realizing that their tanks suck. Specifically, against the Sherman, starts developing and putting time and effort into making a Sherman killer. And this is the tank they end up coming out with, the Chi-Nu, I believe it was called. It's got a lot of the same default characteristics as the Chiha. The chassis wasn't necessarily the problem, it was more so hull and the armor and the gun. A very small amount of them were produced, and they were all saved. They were held back to be used in the defense of the home island, because Japan was, waiting for the inevitable invasion of the home islands from the United States, which never ended up happening because, these things never actually ended up seeing combat, and very few were built, and a lot of them were scrapped after the war, and so very few of them exist nowadays, but there is one in existence, I do believe, that's still in a museum out there today. It's pretty cool. And then, not only that, we have the next variant of the Chi-Nu, the upgunned variant of the upgunned tank, where they put in the high velocity 75. This was end up resulting in what was called the Chi-Nu 2, which is a very unique and very creative name. Now, technically, you can go between the two of the Type 3 Chi-Nu and the Type 5 Chi-Nu, because Type 5, now we're talking about the guns, but Chi-Nu 2 is sort of the layman's terms, the funny man's name for it. Pretty cool that both of these tanks are represented, because I think Japanese tanks as a whole are pretty underrepresented. It's kind of like a Poland situation, where I think most people don't even really know that Japan had tanks. They very much did, and again, they were actually very good when they were built. And also, when it comes to island hopping and the type of war that was fought in the Pacific, it was much more naval focused, and so, yeah, Japan tanks don't really get a chance to be in the spotlight. But they did exist. Japan had tanks, and they did try to modernize them at the very, very end, but unfortunately, it was just too little, too late. This was genuinely one of the other reasons why I bought Battlefield 5, because there are just not enough games that I think include, first of all, the British as a playable faction in World War II, and secondly, the Lee Enfield No. 4 Mark I. And I just really wanted to get a chance to use my gun in a video game. Come on now. Yes, fun fact, for those of you who maybe have seen some of my videos before and noticed this in the background, and were maybe wondering what gun it was, this is indeed a Lee Enfield No. 4 Mark I, the exact same gun that we're seeing here on screen. So this actually gives us a fun opportunity to do a bit of a side segment of Firearms Enthusiast Reacts. So overall, it's actually looking like a pretty faithful representation in the game. The rear aperture sight here is indeed the early war variant, sort of this big blocky piece right here, and it flips up, and that's sort of how you're doing your range adjustments with the weapon. So this is most likely an early war Lee Enfield that they're portraying here. Our user is definitely using it correctly, finger and thumb over the bolt, rather than putting your finger on the trigger. So instead of sort of having to pull the trigger and then you have to take your hand off it and then fully rack the rifle like that, instead you can put your finger on and then keep your two fingers here, and then you pull the trigger and you can just instantly go. And something that I can finally actually verify for myself, something that a lot of firearms enthusiasts notice about guns in video games, is that typically the rear aperture sight itself is usually extremely widened to allow the player to have a larger field of view. I know the Garand in particular is famous for, in video games, having this super wide, like, ring rear aperture, but then in real life it's actually a very, very, very narrow circle. Yeah, it's definitely wider in the game, but this aperture is actually wide enough that when looking down it, you can actually see the entirety of the front sight post. You can see all three sort of prongs, the sight post itself and the two protectors on the side, so that actually is decently realistic. Now, as for the reload in the game, this is actually something I've kind of always wanted to try to see how realistic some of the quick tactical reloads are in the games. So I have my stripper clip right here of 5 dummy rounds. These are spent casings. There are no bullets in here. Primer is already dented. This is all completely safe. So it seems that the way they're doing this is a quite simple: pull the bolt open, slip your strip in. They are pushing down with the thumb, as is standard practice. It's a bit more awkward than it looks in the games, I promise you. And then it seems that they're just taking their back fingers and flicking the stripper clip out. Not really. Let's try that again. Just push your rounds in. You definitely can't do it. So the Lee Enfield reload in this game appears to be impossible. Good to know. Science. Let's take out our 10-round magazine. Yes, these are detachable. I only have the one, so don't think that you can do any quick mag changes, although I suppose it's technically not out of the question. Could you, theoretically, oh no, I gotta reload. Pop this out, put this away, take out a new one. You could probably do a tactical reload with a Lee Enfield. Bang. Take out a new one. That is completely plausible. Let's stop. I want to watch that back because that was actually sick. Let's put this back because this thing is quite heavy. Alright, let's get back to the tanks. As far as gameplay goes, I mean, there are a couple of things that should go without saying, and a couple of things that pretty much every game gets wrong. First of all, moving too fast and shooting too fast. I'm pretty sure every single tank in this game has an incredibly fast reload rate for what they would have had in real life. Although, actually, some of these lighter tanks probably could reload about as fast as they're being portrayed in the game. And the very, very typical video game problem of what the fuck ammunition are we actually shooting? I've discussed this both in the Rhino video and in the Scorpion video, and it's very much applicable here as it was in both those other videos. You fire the cannon, the round hits the tank or the ground or whatever it is, and it explodes in a big ball of fire. The only ammunition that's going to behave that way is some kind of high explosive ammunition, which is an anti-infantry ammunition. It has no penetrative capabilities. It will not do damage to tanks. But video games don't want to have to bother with different ammunition types. They just want you to be able to shoot something that looks cool and is fun and does explosive damage. Now, I think Battlefield is aware of this because they do allow you to select different ammunition types in the game depending on the tank. A lot of these tanks seem to have a researchable upgrade for an armor-piercing ammunition, and they're actually even including heat high explosive anti-tank ammunition in here for the Tiger. And even within the British tech tree specifically, they seem to have an option for HESH, high explosive squash head, which is super cool to see actually, because famously the British have been big fans and big advocate users of high explosive squash head. They kept the Challenger tanks, their Challenger 2s, with rifled cannons specifically so that they could keep using HESH. In case you've ever wondered why the Challenger has a rifled cannon where all other modern tanks have smooth bores, the rifled cannon works better with HESH because HESH isn't fin stabilized or anything like that. It's not a Sabo ammo, so it does actually need the spin of a rifled barrel to help it be more accurate. The British basically used high explosive squash head as one of kind of their main anti-tank ammunitions. For them, it was kind of like the MPAT, what America has right now with MPAT, multi-purpose anti-tank, kind of their one ammunition that does everything. For the British during the Cold War, and even, you know, up till quite recently, for them it was HESH, and it was great. You know, not to say that the British didn't use any armor-piercing fin stabilized, or Challenger 3 now has a smooth bore barrel, so they're finally moving away from it. But that's a fun little nod to that in this game, with the British being able to use HESH. Also, something actually really unique that I'm seeing here in this game that I don't think any other Battlefield game has ever done, which is limited ammunition on everything. In fact, even the machine gun, the coaxial machine gun, seems to have a limited ammunition count. And also, you still also have the overheating mechanic. It's very interesting, and it really highlights sort of like the supply and demand gameplay they're sort of going through here. All of your tanks having this limited capacity for ammunition means that, you know, a tank can only be out on the front line or out engaging enemy units for so long before, even if it's in great health, it has to pull back to refill on ammunition, which I actually really, really like. It's very rooted in reality. I think a lot of people seem to like to think that war is this, you know, it's like a Call of Duty campaign where you're constantly on the front lines, you're constantly fighting, you're constantly in the midst of the action, and something's always happening. But a vast majority of war is sitting back in the depots and resupplying. The vast majority of being a tanker is falling back to the resupply points and the motor pools and doing maintenance and re-upping your ammo. And, you know, once you've done that, once your tank is ready to go for the specific mission that you're being designated, then you go out and get to have fun. At first, to a casual player, it might be very limiting. Why the hell are they only giving me this much ammo? Like, why can't I just go ham with this tank? You know, it may seem unfair, but it's actually quite realistic, at least in portrayal. Not in execution, but in portrayal, which seems to be the mantra of this game, and Battlefield 1 as well. It's why I like both these games quite a bit. There is also individual component damage. Again, this game seems to do a fun hybridization. We don't go for like a fully simulated interior parts and every single component, you know, like War Thunder, but we also aren't full World of Tanks in the sense that it isn't just health bars. We do have turret rings, we do have engines, we do have tracks, all of which can get damaged and hamper your tank's ability to perform at its best. So it's a lot of really interesting mechanics, and it's a lot of very interesting, I think, middle grounds. And then of course the different upgrade trees that you can go down with these tanks, and you can really tailor your tanks to, you know, be certain things. Oh, I've got my Churchill, you know, set up, go down the tree to be a much more anti-infantry, tough nut to crack. And then my Sherman, you know, you can have the 76 and be like a tank destroyer Sherman, and then also you could equip it with the flamethrower and some Willie Pete even, and go out there and be a complete nightmare to any urban environments you might encounter. That kind of thing I think is really, really cool. I actually like your ability to do that. I think the customization and the upgrade system that they have in place in this game is really, really cool. And I'm actually quite sad that this game ceased development and those mechanics were not developed to the extent that they could have been. So I think that just about does it for me on this episode of Tank Enthusiast Reacts. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, go ahead and check out my other stuff. I don't just upload on this channel, I also have a live channel where I go live, I do live streams, not strictly tank focused. Check out the Discord. I do have a Discord where I get together with my fans. If you're kind of wondering why I don't make that many announcements on the YouTube community page, I really do most of that stuff through the Discord. But if you go ahead and do all that, leave a like on the video, subscribe to keep up with my stuff, and thank you guys so much for watching. Whew. Jesus Christ. I know, they actually think the Discord is like a nice and safe place, you know? Like they actually, yeah, like I told them to join the Discord and to check out the streams. Cool. Love you too. There was nobody there. There was an empty phone.